Hello everyone. My name is Ayush Pandey and I'm a PhD candidate in Control and Dynamical Systems at California Institute of Technology. In this talk, I will present our recent work on robustness guarantees for structured model reduction of dynamical systems. I will set up the problem by motivating singular perturbation theory-based model reduction and then formulate a problem for computing robustness of model reduction for a structured model reduction problem. I will present our new results for linear and nonlinear systems using two different methods. And then finally, I will show an application motivated from biomolecular systems for our method. So consider this n-dimensional dynamical system, which is a linear system with matrix A dependent on parameter theta, and a reduced model with the lower dimensions. The structured model reduction problem is when our reduced states are a subset of the states of the full model. The motivation for this kind of problem comes from physical system modeling, where we would like to preserve the meaning of the states and the parameters in the full model into the reduced model. So when we are representing a detailed model in phenomenological terms, we would like to be able to go back and map the reduced model parameters, lumped parameters, to the detailed parameters. And with this structured approach, we are able to have that analytical relationship available to us. An example of this kind of model reduction is the singular perturbation theory-based model reduction that has been studied in the literature for decades. Singular perturbation theory requires a standard form in which you have to represent the full system, which is given here, for example, where the epsilon xc dot equation is the fast dynamics. So when epsilon goes to 0, we can compute the collapsed state as algebraic relationships to derive a reduced model. And this is represented in the block diagram on the right. And the point to note here is that this structure requirement is pretty strict, but it also gives us good methods to derive error convergence bounds on this model reduction. However, representing physical system models in this standard form is not always possible, and so commonly method called quasi-steady state approximation is used, where a priori knowledge is used to decide what states are fast, and then reduced models are derived. However, with this approach, it's not always clear if your reduced model is accurate or valid under your assumptions or not. So to have something in between, in our previous work, we have proposed an automated quasi-steady state approximation method that takes the best of both worlds by having the problem be widely applicable by not requiring the strict structure, but also giving bounds on the error of model reduction, and a robustness metric that quantifies each reduced model according to how robust it is. So with the use of these two metrics, we can choose a final reduced model. Robustness for model reduction has been widely studied problem for control design purposes. However, in our case, we are setting up the problem in a more holistic sense, where we want to look at how uncertain parameters in this autonomous dynamics would affect the model reduction. So the robustness problem that we are interested in is one where we compute the error in model reduction as zeta, as the difference between the outputs, and then we would like to look at how sensitive this error is with respect to changes in parameters. And so with this problem setup in mind, we can compute a metric, which is the robustness metric, after normalizing this S zeta, which is the change of model reduction error with parametric uncertainties. So now let's start to look at the results of computing this robustness metric for linear and nonlinear dynamical systems. First of all, the simplest case would be when the linear system has initial conditions that are dependent on parameters, but the dynamics is independent of parameters. So for this case, we can give a bound on the robustness metric, which is the sensitivity of the error in model reduction, by defining this augmented system. And this is a convention that we will carry throughout this talk, where we define x bar as the augmented state vector with the both full and reduced models, and and consequently we have the dynamics for x bar, which gives out the error in the model reduction as well. So for linear systems, we have the explicit relation for the error in model reduction by using the matrix exponential. And for this case, where the matrix A is not dependent on parameters, we get a simple bound on S zeta norm, which is given by the maximum eigenvalue of the Lyapunov matrix P times the change in initial condition with respect to parameters. So this is pretty intuitive and a simple bound that is easy to compute. So let's look at the proof for this, which is pretty straightforward, where we write the norm of the sensitivity of the error in model reduction as this integral, and then substitute the expression, since we know what the expression is for linear dynamical systems. And then we need to recognize that we have this observability Gramian that appears, and so with the help of that, we are able to give the bound on sensitivity of the error norm as shown here. So now let's move on to the more interesting case of robustness to dynamics. So here we have initial conditions that are independent of parameters, but the dynamics A are dependent on parameters. So for this case, we follow a similar procedure, but we see here that since now A is dependent on parameters, we have a matrix exponential differential that would appear in our proof. So to derive this bound, we first need a lemma that resolves the fact that we would not be easily able to compute the derivative of the matrix exponential, versus in the bound we see here the result, we only need to compute the derivative of the matrix A with respect to parameter theta. So the bound that we give is easy to compute here once we use this lemma that computes the matrix exponential differential. It is not a new lemma. It has been proved in other works as well, but we do give a new proof to it, where the derivative of the matrix exponential with respect to a parameter is given by this integral. So to prove it, it's a pretty preliminary proof. You can just write using chain rule the derivative of the state x and substitute the sensitivity variable over here accordingly, and then use the sensitivity dynamical equation to solve for st to get these two expressions, and then we compare to show that the matrix exponential derivative is equal to this integral. So with the use of this lemma, the proof for this case where the system dynamics are dependent on uncertain parameters becomes pretty straightforward. We can just write the norm integral again and then substitute the S zeta expression and then use the lemma to give the final result, which is easy to compute because we can then just compute the uncertainty of A with respect to parameters here. So this is for linear systems. Now for nonlinear systems, this approach does not really work because we do not have explicit analytical relation for what the error in model reduction would be. And so we use the Lyapunov based approach. We again want to compute the bound on S zeta, and our main result says that if you have the asymptotic stability assumption for the full and the reduced model, you can derive a bound on S zeta norm as shown here. The proof for this one follows similarly, but uses the Lyapunov based method as I mentioned. And the main idea behind the proof is to use the sensitivity equation for the nonlinear systems at each point in trajectory. So where J bar is the Jacobian, which is the block diagonal Jacobian for the full and reduced models. Similarly, we have the augmented vectors Z bar and S bar. And we define this Lyapunov function. And by the use of the derivative of this Lyapunov function and the norm integral, we can solve this integral to give the bound as shown here. And so we have essentially given two different approaches, one for linear systems, which uses linear algebra to give a bound on the robustness metric, and another for nonlinear systems, which gives a separate bound for nonlinear systems using Lyapunov approach. One would expect that for linear dynamics, both of these bounds would yield the same thing, and this is indeed the case, and we have shown this in our paper by using two important relations about the sensitivity and about the norm of the Lyapunov matrix for linear systems. So I can summarize our new results. by saying that we have defined a new problem for looking at robustness of reduced models by looking at how sensitive a reduced model is with respect to parametric uncertainties, and we have shown bounds on this robustness metric for linear and nonlinear systems and shown the equivalence of the two results for linear dynamics. So now I will talk about an application for our method. We have also implemented our model reduction tools as a Python package that has common model reduction tools such as conservation laws and timescale separation. You can install this package by simply running this one line on your terminal. We have validated this Python package by known reduced models. So the enzymatic reaction system is a common example for model reduction, which is a 4-state model, and it can be used to derive a 1-state model for this system. With auto-reduce, you just write these 4 lines of code where you set conservation laws and you solve timescale separation to derive the reduced model. So another application, which is the more important application for our method or motivation to introduce this robustness metric, is that for systems, it is often possible to have multiple reduced models, and we would like to choose between those reduced models. So for an example of gene expression, we derive those reduced models. There are various possible reduced models, and we need to choose between these reduced models. So both of these, and actually in our upcoming journal paper on Journal of Robust and Nonlinear Control, we have shown that there are other possible reduced models as well, which all give similar error performance. So we can use the robustness metrics that we have defined for nonlinear systems to directly compute these and choose the reduced model dependent on which parameter regime we are in and how uncertain a different parameter is. For the purpose of this paper, we discuss more in depth for linear systems, so we can linearize the full and the reduced models and compute this metric for linear systems as well. And we can generate this heat map, which gives us this picture of how robust our reduced model is with respect to each parameter and with time. With that, I would like to conclude and summarize that we have solved a robustness metric problem for structured model reduction for both linear and nonlinear systems. We have shown that a package that has common model reduction tools that can be used to solve these problems, and we have demonstrated the utility of choosing the best possible reduced model using a biological system example. Thank you so much for listening. I will be happy to take questions on Twitter or email.